There are nights when the sea does not rest. Something moves out there. Ships that disappear, voices among the waves, bodies that float where everything sinks. These are 20 stories to feel the ocean, even from bed. Because in the sea, not even sleep is safe. The Castaway of the Caribbean, Poon. In the middle of the Atlantic, far from any coast, floating alone on a small raft made of wood and rope, a man endured the passing of days and nights for more than 4 months. His name was Poon, and his story not only defies the limits of human endurance, but became one of the most extraordinary survival epics ever recorded at sea. It was the year 1942. The world was sunk in the chaos of the Second World War. The sea routes were true battlefields, plagued by German submarines that patrolled the oceans with the intent of cutting off the supply of troops and resources. Poon was a young Chinese man who worked as a kitchen assistant aboard the SS Ben Lomond, a British merchant freighter crossing the waters of the Atlantic on its way to South America. On the 23rd of November, fate laid a trap for him. That day, without any warning, the ship was attacked by a torpedo launched by a Nazi submarine. The explosion was sudden and brutal. In seconds, the hull split. The sea began to swallow the ship with terrifying voracity. Most of the crew died on the spot. Amid fire, debris, and screams, Poon was one of the few who managed to jump into the water before everything disappeared beneath the surface. He did not know how to swim well, but that did not matter. Life, when it grabs you, sometimes does not let go. While the waves remained stirred by the wreckage, Poon managed to cling to a piece of wood. He floated for hours without direction, not knowing whether it was day or night, with no one beside him. Hope appeared in the form of a square lifeboat, built with wooden barrels covered by a canvas frame. Somehow, one of these devices had detached from the ship and was adrift. With his last strength, Poon approached it and climbed aboard. No food, no water, no compass, no sail. Only his will and the sky as witnesses. The first days were a mix of confusion, terror, and disorientation. The sun punished mercilessly, and the nights were cold and long. He had no watch, but he began to count the days by tying knots in a rope. It was his only way to keep track of time. He quickly learned that if he wanted to survive, he would have to adapt to the sea, not fight against it. On the raft, there was a small supply of biscuits, cans of condensed milk, and bottled water. Nothing more. With a practical and methodical mind, Poon began to ration everything. He ate only 1 biscuit per day. He drank small sips of water, just enough to not lose his mind. But he knew it would not last long. Survival was not only a matter of endurance, it was also a matter of ingenuity. Using materials from the raft itself, he built a kind of net with rope and an improvised hook. He began to fish. The ocean gave him small fish, sometimes nothing, sometimes something. He dried them in the sun or ate them raw. He also collected rainwater with a small tarp he improvised. Every drop was a treasure, and as the days passed, his body began to change. He lost weight. His skin toughened. His face lost expression, but his mind remained firm, focused on one goal, not to die. On more than one occasion, he saw ships in the distance, large freighters that passed like ghosts, without even noticing his presence. He tried to signal with mirrors, raised his arms, shouted. Nothing. The sea made him invisible. On one of those occasions, a German submarine appeared, perhaps the same one that had destroyed his ship. It watched him from afar. Even though he had been adrift for weeks, Poon did not want to be rescued. He feared they would take him as a prisoner, or worse, execute him for being an enemy. He preferred to stay alone, on his raft, surrounded by thousands of kilometers of salt water. Hunger began to be a constant shadow. The biscuits disappeared. Water became a luxury that the sky had to grant him. One day he managed to catch a seagull that landed on his raft. He killed it with his hands and drank its blood. It was the only way not to collapse. On another occasion, he caught a small shark that circled his raft. He used its meat as food and its liver as a source of oil. He even cut part of the skin to reinforce his tarp. Everything had a use. Everything was part of the cruel game of continuing to breathe. Loneliness weighed as much as hunger. In the immensity of the sea, one begins to forget the shape of faces, the texture of voices, the meaning of days. Poon sang to keep from going mad. He murmured songs his mother had taught him when he was a child. He spoke aloud to keep the silence at bay. He daydreamed about hot rice, clean beds, the smell of smoke in a kitchen. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he laughed for no reason. The line between sanity and madness is thin when there is no land in sight. Weeks passed, then months. Poon stopped counting the knots in the rope. It no longer mattered whether it was Monday or Friday. But one day, the sea changed. The currents dragged him toward warmer waters. He saw seagulls, seaweed, fish in denser groups. It was a sign that the coast was near. And then, the unexpected happened. A silhouette on the horizon. A Brazilian fishing boat saw him. This time they did see him, and they rescued him. It had been 133 days since the Ben Lomond sank. Poon Lim had survived longer than any other lone castaway on a raft. He was taken to land and hospitalized. His skin was burned by the sun, his bones marked by hunger, but he was still standing. When the doctors saw him, they could not believe it. His story spread around the world. He was decorated by the British government, and his feat was studied by the Navy as an exemplary case of survival. Poon Lim lived many years after that, always with the same calm with which he endured the ocean. He said that, if his story could teach something, it was that human beings are stronger than they imagine when they have no option to give up. The man in the Atlantic freezer, Harrison Okene. The sea is immense, but sometimes the true abyss is not in its depths, but in the most unexpected corners, where time stops and the human body is suspended between life and death, with breath held and hope hanging by an almost invisible thread. Harrison Okene's story seems like an impossible tale, one of those narratives that defy all logic, all calculations, all predictions, because no human being should be able to survive 3 days trapped at the bottom of the sea, in complete darkness, with death brushing past every second. And yet, he did. It all happened at dawn on May 26, 2013. The Jackson 4, a Nigerian-flagged tugboat, was sailing off the coast of Nigeria, assisting oil platforms. It was a functional vessel, old but sturdy, and had a crew of 12 men. Among them was Harrison Okene, 29 years old, the ship's cook, a calm, reserved man, dedicated to his work. That dawn, like many others, he had woken up before everyone else to prepare breakfast. He was still in the bathroom when a brutal force shook the vessel. The blow was sharp, devastating, as if a giant hand had decided to sink the ship with a single movement. In a few seconds, the tugboat completely capsized. The sea, dark and furious, entered through every crevice. The walls creaked, the furniture came loose, the lights went out. And Harrison, still half asleep, was trapped in a small compartment, while the rest of the ship tilted until it was completely upside down, over 30 meters beneath the surface. There was no time to think. There were no instructions to follow. In the chaos of the shipwreck, instinct was his only guide. He swam blindly, through floating furniture, twisted walls, drifting tools. He found a small room where the air had not been devoured by the water. It was a sort of sealed cavity, a corner of the ship where the pressure had created an oxygen bubble. It was small, oppressive, and the temperature dropped by the minute. The sea, at that depth, is so cold it feels like it slices the skin. Harrison, half naked, his clothes soaked and his bones shivering, curled into a fetal position on a metal platform. His body trembled, but his mind did not give up. The darkness was absolute. He did not know whether it was day or night, whether the ship was still moving, whether there were other survivors. All he could hear was the sound of bubbles, the metallic moan of the hull, and from time to time, a distant creak reminding him that he was under tons of water. Without food, without potable water, without a flashlight, all he could do was stay still, save energy, and hope for a miracle. His breathing was slow, measured, as if with each exhalation he was trying to convince the sea to leave him in peace. The hours passed with torturous slowness. The oxygen in the bubble began to run out. Carbon dioxide accumulated. Harrison knew this, although he could not calculate how much time he had left before losing consciousness. Every time he dozed off from exhaustion or cold, his body jolted awake, as if his own mind refused to let go. He was hungry, he was thirsty, but what hurt the most was the uncertainty. How much longer would he last down there? Were they looking for him? Was anyone else alive? In the midst of that darkness, Harrison began to speak to God. He was not a particularly religious man, but desperation has a way of bringing anyone closer to faith. He repeated psalms, prayers, words that came from memory, phrases his mother used to say. That was his only company, because he heard no voices, no footsteps, no human sounds. He was completely alone, trapped in a hopeless trap, breathing increasingly stale air, floating at the boundary between life and death. On the third day, when hopelessness was already absolute, he heard a different sound. Something metallic, something unnatural. It was the sound of diving equipment. The rescue team had arrived. In reality, they were not looking for survivors. They only wanted to recover the bodies, because no one, absolutely no one, could imagine that anyone could still be alive at the bottom of the ocean after 3 days. The divers were South African. One of them, checking the compartments, nearly had a heart attack when a human hand stretched out from the darkness and touched his arm. Harrison, his skin wrinkled, his lips purple, his body on the verge of collapse, was still lucid. He could still speak. The diver's camera recorded the exact moment of the discovery. The image went around the world. A trembling figure in underwear, in thick darkness, emerging from the abyss like an apparition. But the rescue was not immediate. They could not simply pull him out of the water. His body had been under pressure for too long. Bringing him to the surface without care could have caused a deadly embolism. They had to place a mask on him, stabilize his breathing, and accompany him slowly to a hyperbaric chamber, where he remained several more hours, adapting his body to the outside world. It was a delicate operation, but everything went well. Harrison survived. His story was told in newspapers, newscasts, and documentaries. Many called him the Miracle Man. He, however, never saw himself as a hero. He said he survived because he was afraid, because he wanted to see his wife again, because he did not want to die alone, with metal walls as his grave. He returned to land with a new respect for life. But he did not want to return to the sea. He could not. The ocean had shown him its worst face. It had been his prison. Years later, still carrying the weight of his story, Harrison was still surprised to be alive. He remembered every minute of those 3 days with terrifying clarity. He did not like enclosed spaces. He slept with the light on, but he was grateful, because he had seen the bottom of the sea, had heard its silence, had touched the final frontier, and he had come back. The couple lost during their honeymoon, Haynes and Deborah Dugan. There are trips that are planned for months, with every detail filled with hope, from the kind of flowers on the wedding table centerpiece to the color of the sea where one dreams of swimming for the first time as husband and wife. Haynes and Deborah Dugan, a young couple from the United States, had dreamed of their honeymoon on the other side of the world, in a corner of blue waters and warm breezes, where the Seychelles Islands rise like floating gardens in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It was their perfect escape, the beginning of a shared life that promised to be long, peaceful, and, why not, unforgettable. It was, but not in the way they had imagined. The plan was simple. After a few days of rest on the beach, they rented a small boat to explore some of the more remote islands. They wanted something more personal, more intimate. No tourist excursions or tight schedules. They wanted to get lost a little, to enjoy the silence of the sea, the colors that shift when there are no engines or crowds. It was an impulsive decision, perhaps naive, but in the context of a newly blossomed love, everything seemed possible, even sailing carelessly through unknown waters. They set sail early, with minimal provisions, a basic compass, and confidence lent by the good weather. The sun was high, the wind gentle, and the sea calm like a stretched sheet. They navigated between green islets, bathed in deserted coves, and ate fruit while sitting at the back of the boat. They laughed, took pictures, kissed under the sun. That first day was a living postcard, a fulfilled promise. But by evening, without warning, everything changed. The Seychelles, like many regions of the Indian Ocean, can change their mood within minutes. A storm formed on the horizon and approached mercilessly. The sky darkened suddenly, the wind raised thick waves, and the rain turned the sea into a shattered mirror. The small boat, with no advanced navigation technology, no radio, no real protection, was shaken like a toy. They lost control, drifted from the coast, and soon, the world around them lost all references. Water and sky, nothing else. They spent the night wet, embraced, trying to stay warm. The engine had stopped, and the current dragged them eastward. They tried to row, but it was useless. The maps they carried got soaked. The compass fell to the bottom of the boat, and the phone, protected in a bag, had no signal. The darkness was absolute. They did not know whether they were near the coast or in the middle of the ocean. The moon was hidden, the stars veiled. It was like being trapped in a room without walls. At dawn, the storm had passed, but the calm brought no relief. The sea had changed color, deeper, more open. They recognized no landmarks. They tried to orient themselves with the sun, but without knowing in which direction the current had dragged them, they could only guess. There were no nearby boats, no signs of life, no seabirds to give hope. What followed were 4 days adrift, under a burning sun and painful nights. The first day without food was bearable. They had some bottles of water, crackers, and a few pieces of fruit they had bought on the island. But the water did not last more than 48 hours. They tried to collect rainwater using a torn plastic bag and a t-shirt, but the drops were few, scattered, almost cruel. The hunger was persistent, but the thirst was a slow bite. Deborah began to have a dry, cracked tongue. Haynes tried to give her part of his ration, though he himself was already seeing blurry. On the third day, both began to hallucinate. They believed they saw ships, coastlines, heard voices. The relentless sun was robbing them of clarity. And yet, within the horror of dehydration, amid the conversations about their possible death and the silences where only their breathing could be heard, there was a strange kind of love, one that did not depend on desire or future plans. It was a primitive love, of mutual survival, one that was spoken more through gestures than words, like when Haynes covered Deborah's face with a towel soaked in seawater, even knowing the salt would sting her just to give her a bit of shade. Or when Deborah spoke of their home, of how they would paint the bedroom walls when they returned, as if imagining it gave her a reason to hold on. On the fourth day, the silence was interrupted by a mechanical sound. A huge cargo ship appeared on the horizon. They screamed, waved pieces of clothing, turned on a small hand flashlight that, miraculously, still worked. At first, it did not seem like they had been seen. The ship continued on its course. Deborah broke down in tears, her strength almost gone. But then, something happened. The ship began to slow down. A rescue boat was lowered. They had been seen. The rescue was quick, but emotionally devastating. Both were taken from the boat in a state of shock, with sunburns, cracked lips, weight loss, but alive. The crew treated them with care. They were given fluids, blankets, liquid food. The captain, who barely spoke English, smiled at them as if he too understood that he had just been part of something immense. Back on land, doctors confirmed that if the rescue had taken one more day, they likely would not have survived. Their bodies were at the limit, but their minds, curiously, had stayed strong. During their entire recovery, they told their story without drama, without exaggeration. There was pain, yes, but also something close to gratitude. They said they had seen the abyss together and, against all odds, had come out of it. Over the years, the story of Haynes and Deborah was told in interviews, magazines, and documentaries. But they never sought fame. They lived their life in silence, away from the noise. They did not return to the sea for a long time. And when they did, it was from the shore, watching the waves with respect, as if those waters still remembered what they once took from them and later returned. Sometimes, survival stories are not epics of action or grand adventures. Sometimes they are simply that. Two people, alone, holding each other in the middle of the sea, trying not to give up. 76 Days Adrift. Stephen Callahan. The sea, when it becomes infinite and leaves you completely alone, begins to speak in a different language. A language without words, without time, without mercy. Stephen Callahan, a man who loved sailing, ended up listening to that language for 76 days while floating on a raft the size of a table, surrounded by salt water, relentless sun, and the endless silence of the Atlantic Ocean. It all began in January of 1982. Stephen, a naval designer and passionate sailor, decided to cross the Atlantic alone aboard his 6.5-meter sailboat, a small vessel he named Napoleon Solo. His starting point was the island of El Hierro in the Canaries, and his destination was Antigua in the Caribbean. It was a long, dangerous, and demanding journey, but to him, it represented a dream, a way to measure himself against the sea and to test the sailboat he had designed himself. The first few days were calm, almost perfect. Sailing alone offered him a kind of freedom unlike any other. Every wave, every gust of wind, every movement of the hull was a direct conversation with nature. But that calm was only the prelude. On the night of the 6th day, in the middle of a storm that appeared with little warning, his boat received a dry, brutal blow, as if it had collided with an invisible creature. The hull began filling with water immediately. Stephen jumped to investigate with a flashlight in one hand and his heart clenched. He discovered a huge hole at the front. The water entered non-stop. The Napoleon Solo was sinking. He tried to fix it, to bail the water out, to keep it afloat. It was all useless. In the darkness and with the waves shaking the boat like paper, Stephen understood he had to abandon it. With trembling hands, he inflated the life raft, a small circular rubber capsule that barely supported his weight and was not designed for more than a few days. With what he managed to save, an emergency bag, some food, a spear, a solar still, and a few basic tools, he cast himself adrift, at the mercy of the ocean. Dawn found him alone, with the sailboat already submerged, the raft floating in a boundless immensity. From then on, time began to stretch. Each day was a slow-motion battle. The first moments were ruled by confusion. Then came desperation, and after it, a brutal and necessary routine. Stephen understood very quickly that if he wanted to survive, he had to adapt immediately, with no margin for error. The sea does not forgive hesitation. His main food came from the sea. With an improvised spear, he fished mahi-mahi that sometimes jumped into the raft while chasing flying fish. At first, The idea of eating raw fish disgusted him, but soon that discomfort became irrelevant. He ate what he could, how he could, without chewing much. He used his knife, already rusted by salt, to cut pieces he ate while the sun cracked his lips. Water was even more difficult. He had a solar still, a fragile device that turned seawater into drinking water using the sun's heat. But the process was slow and the output minimal. Each day, he managed only a few sips. Thirst became a constant presence. It did not kill him instantly, but it wore him down little by little. Sometimes, rain saved him for a while. He opened his mouth, collected drops with plastic bags, and thanked the sky like someone finding gold in the desert. The sun, for its part, was an insidious enemy. It burned his skin, hurt his eyes, drained his energy. There was no shade, except when he improvised awnings with his clothes or covered his head with pieces of tarp. His body began to change. He lost weight alarmingly. His muscles shrank, his ribs became visible. The salt from the water irritated his wounds, and sleeping was an impossible task. The waves gave him no rest. Each wave moved the raft like a walnut shell. But perhaps the greatest danger was not physical, but mental. Because when you float aimlessly for days, the brain starts to work against you. Inner voices multiply, memories blend, thoughts swing between hope and resignation. Stephen talked to himself. He shouted now and then to remind himself he had a voice. He imagined walking down streets, eating warm bread, sleeping in a bed. And even though his reality was an inflatable dome surrounded by salt water, he forced himself not to give up. At some point, he began seeing ships in the distance. At least 9 vessels passed near him during his weeks adrift. He signaled, used mirrors, shouted until he lost his voice. None saw him. It was as if the ocean had decided to make him invisible. Each of those failed encounters was a stab to his spirit. But he did not give up. He knew that as long as he had food, water, and consciousness, there was still a chance. As the days passed, the raft also began to deteriorate. It filled with water, had leaks, and sharks started to circle it. Sometimes they swam beneath him for hours, hitting the bottom, nosing around. Other times they tried to bite the edges. Stephen scared them off with the spear, with shouts, with blows. A serious attack, a single rupture, and his story would have ended. But it did not end. After 76 days, while floating less than 30 kilometers from the island of Marie-Galante in the Caribbean, a fishing boat found him. They saw him, approached, and finally someone heard him. When they pulled him aboard, he weighed barely 45 kilograms. His body was a shadow. His eyes were sunken, his skin broken, but he was alive. He returned to the United States as a symbol of resilience. He wrote a book, Adrift, where he told his story in chilling detail. Science studied his case as an example of extreme survival, and he, every time he was interviewed, spoke of the sea with respect, with love, and also with fear. Because he had seen it all. Its beauty, its fury, its indifference. Stephen Callahan was not just any castaway. He was a man who, in the most absolute solitude, in the most hostile place imaginable, found within himself a will he did not even know he had. He survived because he did not allow himself to die, and because even in the darkest moments, he believed he could see dry land again. The Miracle of the Boy and the Dolphin, Ángel Delgado. Sometimes the sea holds secrets that cannot be explained, events that defy reason and, no matter how hard one tries to fit them within the bounds of logic, resist being broken down. The story of Ángel Delgado, an 11-year-old boy who disappeared in open waters for more than 6 hours, is one of those tales that seem invented, but are recorded, documented, and still today leave those who hear them perplexed. It all happened off the coast of Veraguas, Panama, in the year 2006. Ángel had gone out to sea with his father and uncle in a small fishing boat. It was a calm weekend afternoon. The sky was clear, and the sea, though as restless as always, did not seem threatening. They left the port around 3 o'clock, looking for a good fishing spot. The boy was used to the sea. He had grown up beside it, learning to row, to throw the rope, to read the wind. He was no beginner. He had that natural confidence of those born looking at the horizon from the shore. But the ocean has subtle ways of testing its own. Halfway there, when they were about 4 kilometers from the coast, a lateral current began to push the boat forcefully. It was not a storm, nor a surge, but a slow yet constant drag, almost imperceptible. The father tried to correct the course, but during the maneuver, a violent jolt rocked the boat. Ángel, who was at the front, lost his balance and fell into the water. The noise was minimal. There was no scream, no dramatic splash. Just the instant the boy disappeared beneath the waves. The father and uncle reacted immediately, turning the boat, calling his name, searching among the sun's reflection on the surface. But there was no sign. In seconds, the water had closed over him as if he had never been there. They searched for almost an hour on their own, shouting, throwing ropes, following the direction of the current. Seeing they could not find him, they returned to the coast and notified the authorities. In less than 2 hours, a search operation was underway, with rescue boats, divers, helicopters. But as the hours passed, no one found him. As the sun lowered in the sky, hope began to fade. The sea is ruthless with small bodies. A child without a life jacket, lost in open sea, with waves nearly a meter high, had little chance of survival. Everyone knew it. Even his mother, who came running to the port upon hearing what had happened, knew deep down that the odds were minimal. Still, she refused to cry. She said her son was strong, that he would not give up, and that God or the sea, or whoever it may be, would not abandon him. At 10 o'clock that night, just as they were considering suspending the search until the next day, a radio call changed everything. A local fisherman, returning from his catch, reported seeing something strange near an abandoned buoy, about 3 kilometers west of the area where Ángel was believed to have disappeared. He did not know if it was trash, an animal, or what, but there was movement. A patrol boat was diverted immediately. What they found left everyone in silence. Ángel was clinging to a swollen log, his lips cracked from the salt, and his eyes wide open as if he had just been born. He was conscious, though dazed. He trembled, but breathed normally. He had no serious wounds, nor signs of having swallowed too much water. He was exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. They brought him onto the boat with the help of 2 rescuers, who could not believe what they were seeing. The boy had been in the water for more than 6 hours, with no protection, no food, no water, no visibility, and he had survived. But what came next took this story from the realm of possibility into the inexplicable. When the doctors examined him, Ángel told his version, with a calm that unsettled everyone. He said that after falling into the sea, he tried to swim toward the boat, but the current dragged him downward. He does not remember swallowing water. He says he felt as if someone or something lifted him up. Then, as he floated aimlessly, he began to see a shadow beneath him. It was big, gray, had one eye looking at me, he said. I thought it was a shark, but it did not hurt me. It pushed me upward, spun me around, stayed with me. The doctors and rescuers looked at each other, unsure of what to say. The boy did not speak jokingly or deliriously. He did not seem to be making anything up. He described the animal with precision, smooth skin, rounded head, gentle movements. A dolphin. According to Ángel, that dolphin stayed with him for hours, circling around him, nudging him upward when he began to sink, and keeping him afloat as if he were its calf. It even guided him toward the log he later clung to, as if it knew he needed something to hold on to. And when the patrol arrived, the dolphin simply swam away. The story was hard to accept at first. Some believed the boy was hallucinating, others that it was a mix of blurred memories. But over time, the details began to align. There were dolphins in that area. Some fishermen reported seeing them nearby that same day. And although there is no conclusive scientific proof that a dolphin can rescue a human consciously, there are multiple documented cases where these animals have acted protectively toward people in danger. Ángel was discharged 2 days later. He was weak but healthy. He returned home as a kind of small hero, though he never acted like one. When asked how he survived, he would simply say that someone helped him. And when he mentioned the dolphin, he did so with the certainty of someone speaking about a real friend. Over the years, his story has been told on television programs, magazine articles, and international reports. Some referred to it as a marine miracle, others as an act of animal intelligence, but most agreed it was something unique, an unrepeatable coincidence between instinct, nature, and the will to live. Ángel is now a grown man. He does not speak much about the incident, but when he does, he always smiles. He says the sea frightened him for a while, but later he returned to it. To fish, to row, to look at the horizon like he did as a child. He never saw the dolphin again, although in dreams, sometimes, he believes it still swims nearby, watching from the shadows. There are stories that do not need explanation. This is one of them, because even though the sea can be cruel, on that occasion, it chose to protect a child. And it did so through a creature that, for one night, became an angel. The Burning Sailboat, the Robertson brothers. Sometimes what begins as a dreamed-of adventure can end as a shipwreck no one could have imagined, not even in their worst nightmares. That was the case for the Robertson family, a group of 6 people who decided to sail around the world, driven by the desire to live something unique, to learn from the sea and from themselves. But what they found in the middle of the Pacific was wilder than any storm and more unexpected than any mechanical failure. Because it was not the weather that brought them to the brink of death, nor the boat that betrayed them, but an encounter as improbable as it was brutal, with a pod of orcas. It was the year 1971, and Dougal Robertson, a former British merchant sailor, had sold his house and most of his belongings to buy a 15-meter sailboat, which he named Lucette. His plan was to sail with his wife Lynn and their 4 children, Douglas, Sandy, Neil, and Robin, from England to Australia, making educational stops at various ports around the world. They were not rich, but they had what it took to embark on a journey of such magnitude, experience at sea, a spirit of adventure, and an almost blind trust in the boat they had prepared with their own hands. For more than a year, everything went well. They crossed the Atlantic, passed through the Panama Canal, explored Caribbean islands, stopped in the Galapagos, and each stage brought them closer as a family. They lived with little, slept together, cooked on board, fished when they could, read, learned languages. It was a nomadic, pure existence, stripped of the world's noise. Lucette was their floating home, and the ocean, their school. But calm at sea is never a guarantee of anything. On June 15, 1972, while sailing through a remote area of the Pacific Ocean, about 1,600 kilometers west of the Galapagos Islands, something struck the hull of the sailboat. First, it was a sharp blow, as if they had run over a submerged log. Then another, harder, and another. When Dougal came up on deck, he could not believe what he was seeing. 3 orcas were deliberately ramming the bottom of the boat, as if trying to break it from below. Within seconds, Lucette began to fill with water. There was no fire, despite what the title sometimes repeated in retellings. But the scene held the same urgency, the same terror. A home falling apart before their eyes. There was no time for questions. They knew they had to abandon the boat. And fast. The family jumped into a small inflatable raft they had as emergency equipment. They also managed to release a small rowing boat, onto which they loaded minimal supplies. A few cans of food, a fishing rod, a compass, some water. Lucette sank with barely a sound. It disappeared beneath the waves as if the sea had simply reclaimed it. In a matter of minutes, the Robertsons went from being sailors with a destination to castaways adrift, in the heart of one of the vastest oceans on the planet. During the first few days, optimism remained thanks to the closeness between them. The family organized like a small army. One fished, another scanned the sky for planes, another tracked their course. They rationed water, took turns rowing. But the sea, as always, sets its own rhythm, and soon began to show its teeth. The inflatable raft partially deflated after a couple of days, leaving them with only a single rigid boat, too small for 6 people. It was an overloaded, unstable shell where they had to take turns lying down, and where each wave could mean the final capsize. Hunger came first. The canned goods did not last. They began catching mahi-mahi, snaring seabirds when one landed nearby. Lynn, the mother, showed a strength that impressed even her children. She plucked the birds quickly, cleaned them with a dull knife, and boiled them in salt water so everyone could at least fill their stomachs with something warm. Every meal was a ceremony of survival, a ritual of endurance. But thirst, as in all shipwreck stories, became the most dangerous enemy. They had to devise ways to collect rainwater, using tarps and spread-out clothing, catching drops in empty cans. Sometimes, 3 days would pass without rain. The sun cracked their skin, the wind split their lips, and arguments began to surface. The body, when at the limit, drags the mind down with it. By the 20th day, they were in critical condition. They had to decide whether to keep drifting or row in a specific direction. Dougal, with his experience, tried to calculate where the current was taking them. They had no map, but they knew the Marshall Islands were hundreds of kilometers to the west. If they could reach them, they might have a chance. If not, the sea would swallow them without witnesses. They rowed in turns for hours under a merciless sun. Their hands were full of blisters, their arms exhausted, but they kept their course. Sometimes they spotted ships in the distance, gray smudges on the horizon. They shouted, waved clothes, used mirrors to signal. It never worked. Once, they believed they had been seen, but the ship continued on its way, indifferent. It was a harsh blow. Hope, when broken, hurts more than hunger. On the 38th day, something happened that changed everything. They spotted an island in the distance. It was small, just a strip of vegetation in the middle of the water, but it was land. With the little strength they had left, they pushed toward it. When they arrived, there were no houses, no people, no help. But they found coconuts, fresh water, and shade. They rested for a day, regained their strength, and returned to the boat. Yes, they returned to the sea. They knew that if they waited there, no one would find them. They had to keep going. Finally, on the 38th day of their shipwreck, a Japanese fishing vessel saw them. This time, they were seen, and they were rescued. All 6 survived. They returned to England, where their story became a legend. Dougal wrote a book, Survive the Savage Sea, in which he detailed those timeless days, those weeks where love, willpower, and luck intertwined to keep them alive. No one ever found out why the orcas attacked that boat. Some say they mistook the hull for a whale. Others believe it was simple animal curiosity. But the result was the same. A family destroyed by the sea and, at the same time, rebuilt by it. Lucette was lost to the bottom of the Pacific, but its story continues to float, like a beacon for those who believe that the sea can swallow you in an instant, and also save you if you have something to fight with. The lifeboat in the Arctic, the tragedy of the SS Dumaru. The sea can be cruel under the blazing Pacific sun, but it becomes a merciless entity when dressed in ice, when it turns each gust of wind into blades and every wave into a deadly trap. Some shipwrecks are immediate tragedies, brief bursts of horror. And then there are those that stretch out like punishment, day after day, turning survival into a parade of extreme decisions. What the crew of the SS Dumaru endured is a brutal example of the second kind. It was the year 1918, in the midst of the First World War, when the Dumaru, a wooden-hulled steamship, was built in Oregon, United States, as part of the war effort. It was brand new, had barely touched the water, and its mission was to carry cargo from the Pacific coast to strategic points across the ocean. It was not a combat vessel, but it carried something just as dangerous: explosives. Loaded with ammunition and ammonium nitrate, the Dumaru set sail for Manila. No one knew that this maiden voyage would also be its last. The tragedy began with a sudden explosion. There was no combat, no torpedo, just an internal failure, perhaps from overheating or a poorly controlled spark. The nitrate reacted, and the ship exploded in the middle of the ocean. The structure, though solid for the type of vessel it was not built to carry such a load. Within minutes, it split apart and began to sink. Many of the sailors died instantly. The rest, blinded by smoke and fear, managed to throw themselves into the water and climb aboard the lifeboats. One of those boats, the one that would float adrift the longest, carried 13 men. They had no food, almost no water, and the cold was unbearable. Unlike other shipwrecks where the sun burns and thirst comes from evaporation, here the threat was the constant cold, which crept into their bones like an incurable disease. Each icy wave hit them with force, and the night seemed like an eternity of darkness and pain. They did not know exactly where they were. They knew they were far from main routes, that no one would come soon, and they knew that if they wanted to survive, they would have to face decisions that are taught in no navigation manual. The first days were spent waiting. They hoped to see smoke on the horizon, sails, some sign of help. They rationed the little liquid they had, used every drop of rain, sucked on pieces of wood to trick their dry mouths. Hunger was another matter. The lack of food began to affect them from the second day. Some tried to fish without success. Others clung to hope of being rescued. But the days went by. Their strength was fading, and the sea, always indifferent, kept tossing them like an empty bottle. By the 5th day, one of the men no longer moved. He died, silently, without complaint. That was when the conversation that no one wanted to have emerged. The idea floated in the air before anyone said it aloud. Eat the dead. Not out of savagery, not out of madness. It was the only way to keep breathing. Desperation in situations like that becomes a kind of new logic. A thought system where morality bends, not because one wants it to, but because the body no longer has reserves to uphold it. And they did it. With trembling hands, with eyes that avoided looking directly, they began to cut the flesh of their fallen companion. They cooked it with improvised fire, burning wood scraps that still held some dryness. The fat sizzled, the smell was unbearable, but they ate in silence. There was no other choice. And then came another dead man, and another. Each time weaker, more aware that they were crossing a line that would mark them forever. One of the sailors recorded the days on a piece of wood, marking it with a rusty nail. 13 men began that drift, but only 4 survived. The rest died from hypothermia, from weakness, or perhaps from having lost the will before the body. The living spoke little, only enough to organize shifts, to maintain the bare discipline that separated them from the abyss. When they were finally found, more than 2 weeks had passed. The rescuers could not believe what they saw. Human figures barely able to stand, covered in burns from the cold, with sunken eyes and broken skin. They did not speak of what they had done for days. But once they reached land, the questions came as quickly as the morbid curiosity. Newspapers echoed the story. Some called them heroes, others called them savages. But they, those who lived through that hell, knew the truth was more complex. There was no heroism, only necessity. One of the survivors, years later, wrote a detailed account of what happened. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not justify anything. He simply told the facts. He spoke of the cold, of the hunger, of the silence that settles when you float in the middle of the Arctic with the certainty that maybe no one will ever say your name again. He said the worst part was not what they did to survive, but living with the memories afterward. The story of the Dumaru lifeboat became an emblematic case, studied by sailors, psychologists, and anthropologists. Not for its morbidity, but for what it reveals about the human being when pushed to the most extreme limit. Because the ocean, in its vastness, not only tests physical endurance, it also strips down the mind, dismantles principles, rewrites the rules. Today, no trace remains of that lifeboat. It rotted in some forgotten port, or sank in silence after completing its final voyage. But its story still floats, uncomfortable, harsh, necessary. Because not all survival stories are made of pure courage or miraculous rescues. Some are built with raw decisions, with gestures that hurt and that continue to weigh long after stepping back onto solid ground. The loner of the Indian Ocean, Abhilash Tomi. There are moments when the sea seems like a perfect mirror, a dome of calm and beauty where time slides by slowly, without shocks. But one night is enough, one cursed wave, one gust that comes from nowhere, for that same sea to become a silent battlefield, where life hangs on details as fragile as a sail rope or the endurance of the human body. Abhilash Tomi came face to face with that duality when the Indian Ocean broke his back, shattered his boat, and left him stranded thousands of kilometers from everything, motionless and alone, with the certainty that the world no longer had him on its map. Abhilash was no novice. An officer in the Indian Navy, an experienced sailor, he was the first Indian to have circumnavigated the planet non-stop and solo. He knew winds, he knew constellations, he knew how to live with the ocean for months. In the year 2018, he accepted the toughest challenge of his career, to participate in the Golden Globe Race, a regatta that replicates the sailing conditions from 50 years ago. That means no GPS, no radar, no modern technology. Only sails, paper maps, a sextant, and the instinct of someone who trusts the horizon more than a screen. He set sail in July from France, aboard his boat Thuria, a wooden replica of the legendary Suhaili, Robin Knox Johnston's sailboat. For weeks, he sailed across the Atlantic with the discipline of a watchmaker. Every maneuver was measured, every decision studied. The pace was slow but steady. He crossed the equator, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and entered the Indian Ocean. He was following his route. The sea was rough, but not hostile, until it was. On the 21st of September, in the waters of the southern Indian Ocean, a storm formed with a violence that left no time even for fear. The waves reached 20 meters. The winds roared with cyclone force. Abhilash, with years of sea behind him, knew he had no way to escape. He could only resist. He furled the sails, tied himself to the structure, and prepared for the impact. The boat held out for several hours, bouncing like a stone thrown at random. But suddenly, in the middle of the night, A huge, almost vertical wave struck the Turia from the side and completely overturned it. Abhilash was hurled against the cabin wall with animal violence. He heard a dry crack in his back and then nothing. Pain, paralysis, darkness. He tried to move, and the body did not respond. He tried to sit up, and he could not. His legs were motionless. He could only drag himself with his arms, breathe with difficulty, and feel how the water entered every corner of the sailboat, which was no longer a boat, but a floating tomb. For nearly an hour he was convinced he was going to die. The storm kept roaring. The mast was broken, the radio equipment destroyed, the food supplies soaked, the body barely functional. But there was one thing in his favor. The emergency beacon, a device that sends a satellite signal in case of accident, was still in place. With effort, as if pushing a mountain, he managed to drag himself to it and activate it. From that moment on, time became his enemy. The world knew someone was calling for help, but not who, nor exactly where, nor in what condition. On land, the Indian Coordination Team, together with the race organization, began a race against the clock. They estimated his last location, contacted nearby ships, and coordinated with the French Navy, which had a patrol vessel on Réunion Island, over 3,000 kilometers away. Meanwhile, in the middle of the sea, Abhilash was still there. The boat had stabilized, though damaged. The interior was a mess of splintered wood, loose cables, dirty water. He could only move with his arms, and it took him hours. Each movement was an electric shock in his spine. He had a broken vertebra. He ate little. He drank carefully from the water that was not contaminated. He slept in short intervals, with a knife nearby in case he had to defend himself from a rat or a seabird that entered the hull. The sea was calmer, but the feeling of death was constant. More than 3 days passed. The pain became part of the landscape. Abhilash spoke to the ceiling, to the wind, to memories. He repeated to himself that he must not sleep for more than 20 minutes. Dreaming was dangerous. Relaxing could be the end. He had spent so much time commanding a boat, but now the command was to endure without moving. Finally, on the 24th of September, a reconnaissance plane spotted him from the sky. They saw the battered sailboat, saw the faint wave of an arm from a hatch. They confirmed there was a survivor. The coordinates were sent to the French ship Osiris, which was already heading to the area. It would still take several hours to arrive. But now there was a direct line between the sea and salvation. The rescue was dramatic. A helicopter had to descend with surgical precision in the middle of a still choppy ocean. Abhilash was lifted with a harness, like a defeated figure. He was weak, dirty, barely conscious. He was immediately taken to a military hospital, where they confirmed he had suffered multiple spinal fractures and severe spinal cord compression. He was close to becoming paralyzed, but he was alive. For weeks, he did not speak publicly. He focused on healing, on learning to walk again, on processing what he had lived through. When he finally gave an interview, he did so with a disconcerting calmness. He did not complain. He did not dramatize. He said the sea had taught him once again how fragile everything is, and that if he had a chance to return, he would. And he did. In 2022, 4 years after that shipwreck, Abhilash Tomi returned to compete in the Golden Globe race, this time with a reinforced boat, with a spine repaired by surgery, and with his determination intact. He crossed oceans, faced storms, and finished the race in second place, after more than 230 days at sea. His story was no longer just that of a castaway. It was that of a man who lost control of his body in the middle of the most merciless ocean, but who held firm the helm of his will. Abhilash Tomi is, perhaps, one of the few who can say they defeated the sea twice. Once by surviving the pain, and again by sailing again when everyone thought he never would. The woman who survived. 2 weeks alone. Jennifer Appel. The idea of setting sail into the unknown holds a certain romantic allure. The sea seems to promise freedom, silence, and a distance from the noise of the world. For Jennifer Appel, setting off from Hawaii bound for Tahiti on a journey of more than 4,000 kilometers was the beginning of a new life. Simpler, more connected with nature, and with that version of herself that only appears when one is far from everything. But what started as a dream adventure turned into a slow nightmare, filled with silence, fear, and a loneliness that became almost physical. It was May of 2017. Jennifer, an amateur sailor but well prepared, left Honolulu aboard her sailboat, the Sea Nymph, accompanied by her dog Valentine and her friend Tasha Fuyava, who shared both the enthusiasm for sailing and the need to escape urban life. They carried provisions for several months, communication systems, fishing gear, a desalination system, solar panels, and everything that was supposed to be necessary for a long but peaceful journey. They had planned carefully, without haste, imagining endless sunsets and calm days drifting between islands. But the sea, as always, had its own agenda. A few weeks after setting sail, an unexpected storm struck their route with fierce winds and waves as tall as houses. The sailboat was violently shaken. The mast held firm, but the navigation system suffered severe damage. The engines failed, and the rudder was compromised. Without a clear direction and no way to communicate, they were adrift. They thought they could fix it in the following days, that it was a manageable setback. But time passed, and the sea offered no respite. In the first few days after the storm, the two women tried to keep their spirits up. They checked what was working, redistributed provisions, and tried to use the sails to get closer to an island. But they were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, one of the largest oceans on the planet, where distances deceive and isolation can feel like a prison without bars. They couldn't ask for help. Attempts to contact via radio were unsuccessful. The satellite equipment didn't respond. The only thing that worked was instinct. Jennifer was strong, both physically and mentally. She had trained her body, knew the systems of the boat, and had experience with storms, but nothing had prepared her for what would come. 5 months adrift, with no contact with land, moving with the currents and wind, the sun burning their skin by day, and the cold biting their bones by night. But before that, there was a crucial moment. After 2 weeks, when the situation had already become critical, and they began rationing even the fresh water they extracted with their desalination system, Jennifer was left alone for hours. Tasha, exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed, locked herself in the small cabin of the sailboat and completely disconnected. She couldn't help. She couldn't react. Valentine, the dog, panted nonstop. The sun fell with unbearable weight. It was during this stretch that Jennifer realized she had to hold it all together on her own. The boat, the food, the water, the calm. If she gave up, the three of them would sink. During that long night, with the rudder tied with ropes and no direction, she spoke to the sea. Not to find answers, but to stay sane. She sang songs from her childhood, recited poems, and screamed at the sky. The loneliness wasn't just the absence of people. It was the feeling that no human being knew they were out there, floating as an invisible dot among millions of square kilometers of water. Over those weeks, she improvised methods to keep the boat running in some way. She used nets to catch fish, collected rainwater with an improvised tarp, repaired parts of the cabin with duct tape, patched sails, and even used an old knife to unclog the engine pump in a desperate attempt to regain some propulsion. Every small achievement was a triumph, a way of reminding herself that they could still fight. There were moments of cruel hope. One day they spotted a cargo ship on the horizon. They turned on lights, signaled with mirrors, and screamed until their throats were raw. The ship continued on its way without noticing them. Another day they thought they heard a radio signal, a distant voice. but it was interference, nothing more. And still, they kept going. The routine became their mental anchor. Jennifer cooked rice with dried fish, organized watch shifts, and spoke to her dog as though it could respond. She sang to keep it calm. Slowly, Tasha started to come out of her shock, but Jennifer remained the one making decisions. Her will was the engine that pushed that broken sailboat through the Pacific, like an internal lighthouse refusing to go out. What's most impressive about this story isn't the time they spent adrift. There are records of shipwrecked people who have survived longer. What makes Jennifer Appel's case different is how she withstood the emotional collapse, how she kept her mind intact without solid ground beneath her feet for more than 150 days. There aren't many people who can look at the open sea every day without going mad, without losing a sense of self. The rescue, when it came, wasn't epic. It was almost casual. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter detected the sailboat on its radar while crossing a maritime area more than 1,000 kilometers from Japan. As they approached, they saw two exhausted figures on deck, a woman waving and a dog wagging its tail nonstop. The sea nymph floated like just another survivor. The video of the rescue went viral. Two women with sunburned faces, smiling with that expression of relief and exhaustion only those who have returned from the edge can have. On board the rescue vessel, Jennifer hugged Valentine as though she were a daughter. Tasha couldn't stop staring at the sea. They had been swallowed by it, and against all odds, returned. The press was filled with theories. Some doubted the details. Others minimized what happened. But the reports, communications, and search records confirmed the story. Jennifer Appel had kept her group, her boat, and her sanity alive for more than 5 months, facing not a single spectacular storm, but an endless succession of difficult days, small but vital decisions, and quiet resistances. Today, back on land, Jennifer lives far from the coast. She hasn't stopped sailing, but now with a different mindset. Sometimes she tells her story at conferences. Sometimes she simply lets it sleep in her memory. But if there's one thing that became clear after her return, it's that there are people the sea tests in a different way. Not with a great shipwreck, not with a dramatic night, but with the invisible wear and tear of the days, with the endless waiting, with the battle against hopelessness. And in that battle she won, the Ghost Submarine. The case of the ARA San Juan. There are stories that don't end with a rescue, nor with a sigh of relief. There are stories that, instead of closing, remain suspended in time, floating between mystery, pain, and memory. The story of the ARA San Juan submarine, lost in the depths of the South Atlantic, is one of those stories. A tragedy that shook an entire nation, that kept whole families clinging to phones and screens for weeks, that exposed mistakes, silences, and omissions, and that to this day continues to throb like a wound that won't heal. The ARA San Juan was a TR-1700 class submarine of German origin, incorporated into the Argentine Navy in the 1980s. It had been modernized, refurbished, and adapted to continue in service despite the wear and tear of years spent navigating underwater. It was a silent vessel, designed to move undetected, with a crew trained to spend entire days immersed in darkness, surrounded by steel, pressure, and protocols. 38 men and 1 woman were part of that final mission. Each one carried their own story aboard, their fears, routines, and hopes. None could have imagined what was about to unfold. They set sail on November 13, 2017, from Ushuaia, at the southernmost tip of the country. Their mission was routine: patrol Argentine waters, maintain military presence, and report unauthorized activity in the exclusive economic zone. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The weather was unstable, as always in that part of the world, but within the expected parameters. A few days later, the first signs of trouble began to appear. Leaks, electrical failures, the smell of smoke. The captain reported a malfunction. Water had entered through the ventilation system and reached the bow batteries, causing a short circuit. The message was clear, but not desperate. They continued navigating. They asked for instructions. No further responses came. On November 15th at 7:30 a.m., the last official communication from the submarine was recorded. After that, there was total silence. The sea stood still again. No new positions were reported. No further signals came. And so, the nightmare began. At first, the news barely made a dent in the media. A temporary loss of contact, a delay, something technical. But as the hours passed, the concern grew. Time began to pass like a clock without hands. No one knew for certain where the San Juan was, whether it had surfaced, or if it had submerged in an emergency, or if it had exploded. The versions were scarce and contradictory. Families began arriving at the naval bases. Eyes searched for explanations. Voices demanded certainty. None was given. In the following days, one of the largest search operations ever conducted in the South Atlantic was launched. 18 countries participated, including the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, Chile, and Brazil. Satellites, planes, ships, smart buoys, all in service of one clear mission: find the San Juan. Yet the ocean, the one that always returns something, seemed determined this time to keep it secret. The days passed. Hopes shattered. Families clung to the idea that somehow they had become stranded at the bottom, out of communication, waiting to be found. But logic told another story. A submarine of that class, without renewed air, cannot sustain its crew for more than a week without surfacing. The deadline passed. Pain began to settle in like a truth shouted loudly. On November 23rd, the news no one wanted to hear arrived. An acoustic anomaly had been detected, recorded on the same day of the disappearance, about 500 kilometers from Comodoro Rivadavia. An explosion. A clear sign that the submarine had collapsed. According to the analysis, that explosion had been equivalent to the detonation of several tons of TNT. The hull had been compressed by the pressure, as if a giant fist had crushed it more than 900 meters deep. There was no time for suffering, no room for reaction. It was instantaneous. However, the story did not end there. The search continued for an entire year. A private company, Ocean Infinity, was hired to use autonomous exploration vehicles. Finally, on November 17, 2018, almost exactly 1 year after the disappearance, the submarine was found. It was at a depth of 907 meters, in an area of underwater canyons, shattered, with the hull split but recognizable. The images showed the silence of the steel resting at the bottom of the sea. There was no chance of rescue, nor of recovering the bodies. Only the mourning remained, long, painful, and full of questions that still lack a definitive answer. Why was a submarine with technical problems allowed to sail? Why was it so delayed in accepting the gravity of the situation? What exactly happened inside the San Juan during its final hours? There are versions, hypotheses, documents, but the full truth stayed down there, nearly 1,000 meters away, wrapped in cold water and total darkness. The case of the ARA San Juan hit Argentina like a slow lightning strike. The families, organized, marched for months, demanding justice, explanations, respect. Investigations, parliamentary commissions, and legal files were opened. Some voices pointed to negligence, others to structural failures that had been dragging on for years. But no conclusion brought comfort. There is a story that circulates among the fishermen of the South. They say that, weeks after the sinking, one of them heard a sharp knock against the hull of his boat. At first he thought it was a log, but when he looked, he saw nothing. Then others reported seeing a light under the water in areas where there should have been nothing. Lights that turned off as soon as they were seen. They are nothing more than legends, echoes of a collective mourning that remains unresolved. But in a country where pain turns into mythology, where the sea mixes with the sacred, it is not strange that the San Juan is already seen by many as a ghost submarine, a floating tomb, a presence that is still there, reminding us of what cannot be forgotten. Today, in Mar del Plata, there is a mural with the faces of the 44 crew members. They are all gazing at the horizon, as if waiting to return. And in a way, they do. Because the ARA San Juan is no longer just a military case. It is an open wound in the soul of those who love the sea, a warning about dangerous silences, and a reminder that even in the darkest places of the ocean, there are always those who continue waiting for a signal. The swimmer of the 7 days, Maria Ochoa. The human body is not made to inhabit the sea, and yet there are times when it seems to defy its own limits, as if by pure instinct to stay alive, it could bend the rules of nature. The story of Maria Ochoa, a woman who spent 7 days swimming between islands in the Pacific after the shipwreck of a boat, is one of those stories that is hard to believe, even though it is documented. One of those that seem torn from a survival novel. But that happened, without embellishments or licenses, under the sky of a vast and silent ocean. Maria was 34 years old and was from a small coastal town in Nicaragua. Since she was a child, she learned to swim as one learns to walk, without school or style, just her feet searching for the bottom and her arms making their way through the waves. The water was part of her daily life. She worked as a local guide on small maritime excursions, helping tourists discover the less visited corners of the coast. The sea didn't scare her, but she didn't underestimate it either. She respected it. She knew that a well-handled boat could be safe, but she also knew that just one mistake was enough for everything to go to the bottom. The accident happened in April of 2009. 6 people were aboard a fiberglass boat, including Maria. The plan was to visit several islands near the Gulf of Fonseca, make a stop for lunch on a beach, and return in the afternoon. Everything was going normally until the engine started to fail halfway. At first, it was just an irregular noise, a strange knocking in the propeller, but in less than 10 minutes, the boat stopped completely, adrift in an area with no signal, with clouds closing in on the sky. They tried signaling other boats, but no one was near. The wind picked up, the waves began to push strongly from the side, and within hours, the sky turned gray, then dark, and finally, relentlessly, black. An afternoon storm in the Pacific doesn't give you a second warning. The boat began to spin uncontrollably, the bow rising and falling from the water like a tossed cork. By 6 in the evening, a particularly high wave capsized it completely. The passengers were thrown in different directions. Screams, foam, silence. Maria managed to grab hold of a fishing buoy floating a few meters away. She didn't know what had happened to the others. She never saw them again. She spent the night clinging to the damp plastic, with tense muscles and a restless mind. The sea was slowly pulling her into the open water, but she didn't know that. At dawn, the scene was even more desolate. Water in every direction, no shore in sight, no sign of the boat, no voices. Then she realized they wouldn't find her, that if she wanted to get out of there, she would have to move. And she moved. For 7 days, Maria swam through currents, pushed by the wind, guided by instinct, with no map or precise direction. She ate small jellyfish, seaweed that she found floating, and drank rainwater she caught in her t-shirt, squeezing it drop by drop into her mouth. When it rained, she was thankful as if they had given her a cold bottle. When the sun was high, she covered her head with a bra to avoid sunburns. Each day was a negotiation with her body, with her exhaustion, with her faith. The Pacific currents can be treacherous. One thinks they are making progress, but in reality, they are going backward. Sometimes she swam for 5 hours straight, only to discover she was at the same point where she had started. Other times, a single current would carry her for kilometers without her moving a muscle. The nights were the worst. The water dropped in temperature, and her thoughts grew darker. She remembered her mother, her children, the times she had seen shipwrecks on TV, and wondered if she would know how to survive. Now, it was no longer a question. On the 4th day, she began to see seabirds flying in the distance. She knew what that meant. Where there are birds, there are fish, and where there are fish, land is not far. She forced herself to swim in that direction. She didn't think about how much her arms hurt or the sting in her eyes. She thought about getting there, about not dying in the middle of the sea like a nameless shadow. The sun had cracked her lips. Her legs no longer responded like before. But willpower is a tool that sharpens with danger, and Maria had already honed hers like a knife. On the 6th day, while resting floating on her back to regain strength, she saw the silhouette of an island. It was small, rocky, with scarce vegetation, but it was land. She swam the last few hours with a mixture of desperation and relief, like someone who has nothing left to lose. She reached the shore with fingers twisted from the water, skin reddened, shoulders burned. She dragged herself onto the sand until she lay face down, gasping. There she spent the night, wrapped in a blanket of silence. At dawn on the 7th day, a group of local fishermen found her. She was dehydrated, thin, with marks all over her body, but alive. She couldn't speak fluently. She only managed to say her name. She was taken by boat to the nearest clinic, where the doctors attended to her with care. None of them could understand how she had survived. When they began to hydrate her and treat her wounds, she kept repeating that she had had no choice, that she had to return. Maria fully recovered weeks later. Her story was told in local media first, and then internationally. Some doubted it, as always happens when a story challenges the established. But the doctors confirmed her condition, the fishermen confirmed her discovery, and her body had all the signs of having spent days in the water. No detail was exaggerated. She returned to the sea after a year. She did it slowly, first from the shore, then in small boats. Not out of whim, nor pride, but because she understood that her relationship with the ocean had changed. She had conquered it, yes, but she had also listened to it, felt it close, and knew that there is no way to be the same after something like that. The sea owed her nothing, and neither did she owe it anything. What Maria Ochoa lived through during those 7 days was not a miracle nor an athletic feat. It was an exact mixture of endurance, knowledge, and a will that, when activated at the right moment, can become the rope that pulls you from death to the edge of life. The Fisherman Who Became One with the Sea, Salvador Alvarenga. There are moments when the border between man and the ocean blurs, as if the lines separating one from the other slowly begin to fade until all that remains is a figure floating between water, sky, and time. This is what happened to Salvador Alvarenga, a Salvadoran fisherman who spent 438 days adrift in the Pacific Ocean, in one of the most extraordinary and extreme survival episodes ever recorded in modern times. A journey that began as an ordinary fishing trip and ended as a brutal, profound, and unrepeatable transformation. Salvador, 36 years old, lived on the coast of Chiapas, Mexico, where he had settled years earlier after leaving his native El Salvador. He worked in a fishing cooperative, went out to sea almost every day, and knew its rhythms as one knows an old song. He had experience, intuition, and an absolute respect for the unpredictable power of the currents. He was not reckless. He was meticulous, observant, and always returned home, even if his hands were empty. On November 21st, 2012. He left as he had many times before, in a small fiberglass boat, accompanied by a young assistant named Ezequiel Cordoba, whom he had never worked with before. The plan was to fish for sharks for about 40 hours and return to port. But this journey had no intention of following any plan. A few hours after setting sail, the sky changed without warning. A storm formed over the Pacific, and soon the boat was being shaken by high waves, gusty winds, and unrelenting rain. The engine failed. The GPS stopped working. The radio equipment was swept away by a wave. The coolers, filled with fish, began to lose their contents as the boat spun aimlessly. In the course of one night, they were completely lost, with no engine, no oars, and no way to communicate with anyone. The only thing left was to float. During the first days, they clung to the idea that they would soon be found. The boat was white, visible, and they were relatively close to shore. They thought someone would give notice, that a friendly vessel would see them. But days passed, and the sea pushed them farther away. Each sunrise was lonelier than the last. Each afternoon was a farewell to what they had known as solid ground. They began to live off the sea as best they could. They caught flying fish that fell into the boat. They collected turtles that swam nearby and drank their blood when the fresh water ran out. When it rained, they opened their mouths to the sky and caught drops with their hands. At first, they ate what they could with some organization. Then there was no order. It was pure necessity. The raw guts became routine. The stomach turned into a stone that only asked to be filled. The body endured, but the mind began to break down. Ezequiel, the young man, couldn't take it. He was only 22 years old, and his emotional resilience crumbled after a few weeks. He refused to eat raw meat, became dehydrated, and weakened. He began talking to himself, saying that they were coming to get him, that he saw ships that weren't there. He murmured prayers, raved. Salvador tried to convince him to eat, to drink turtle blood, to hold on a little longer. But there was no use. One morning, Ezequiel woke up without a pulse, his eyes open, staring at a sky that offered no answers. Grief at sea is not like grief on land. Salvador kept his body for 6 days, talking to him, asking forgiveness for not being able to save him, conversing as if he were still breathing. On the 7th day, in an act that broke his soul, he had to let him go. He placed him in the water, watched the body drift away silently, and was left completely alone in the middle of the world's largest ocean. From then on, something changed in him. He no longer acted like a castaway waiting to be rescued. He began to merge with the sea, as if he were part of the landscape. He learned to read the clouds, to predict rain by the flight of birds, to identify fish by their shadows. He spoke with God, with sharks, with his mother. He saw visions of his daughter, remembered his childhood, sang songs he didn't know he still remembered. He lost count of the days and surrendered to the rhythm of the water. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he laughed. Other times, he simply floated in the boat, staring into space as if he no longer belonged to the world of men. For over a year, Salvador Alvarenga drifted, covering more than 11,000 kilometers without knowing it. No one was looking for him anymore. He had been given up for dead, his name filed away, his story told in the past tense. Until, on January 30th, 2014, almost 14 months after he had departed, his boat ran aground on a reef at Tile Islet, part of the Eben Atoll in the Marshall Islands. There, a group of locals saw him walking barefoot on the beach, his body weathered, hair tangled, skin cracked by the sun. At first, they thought he was a madman, a castaway from another time. But when he said his name and told his story, everything made sense. He was taken to the hospital, treated, and interrogated. No one could believe what he was saying. The doctors confirmed that his vital signs were stable, although his body showed clear signs of severe malnutrition and chronic dehydration. He had lost more than 20 kilos, his liver was inflamed, and he had sores on his feet. But he was lucid. He recounted every detail calmly, without drama, without embellishments. He knew he had survived because he had surrendered to the sea, because he had stopped fighting it and had learned to live as an unexpected guest in its kingdom. After his rescue, his story spread around the world. Some doubted. Articles were written, investigations were made, even a book was published. But all the facts match. The time, the trajectory, the current's route. Everything fit. Salvador didn't lie. He simply lived something few can endure. Today, he lives in El Salvador, in a quiet place surrounded by fields, by silence. He doesn't like to talk much about the topic. He says the sea took him for a while and brought him back with something less, but also with something new. Sometimes he gazes at the horizon without saying anything, as if he could still hear the voices of the ocean, the ones that are only understood after floating so long with no land in sight. His story is not a story of miracles. It is a story of adaptation, of resistance, of madness, and clarity intertwined. One man, one boat, and an endless ocean, and the impossible desire to live, even when everything around you seems to invite you to give up. The Timeless Boat, the case of the three teenagers from Tokelau. The sea, so vast and seemingly motionless, sometimes swallows reality without leaving a trace, as if it wraps time in a soundless bubble detached from the world, where clocks cease to make sense and days dissolve one after the other like drops of water. This is what Samuel, Philo, and Edward, three teenagers from Tokelau, experienced when they disappeared in the Pacific Ocean in 2010 and were found alive 50 days later, when no one believed there was any chance of seeing them again. Their story seems written in legendary ink, but it happened, and it serves as proof that humans, even in their younger version, are capable of defying limits when life clings like a wounded animal that refuses to let go. Tokelau is a remote territory made up of 3 tiny atolls that belong administratively to New Zealand but live by their own rules, with a rhythm marked by the tide, fishing, and the calm of simplicity. There are no roads, no buildings, no traffic. Everything revolves around the sea. The boat is an extension of the body, and the horizon, a daily promise. For the teenagers there, sailing between islands is almost a rite of passage. So when Samuel, 15, Philo, 16, and Edward, 14, decided to borrow a small aluminium dinghy to visit the neighboring islet, no one saw it as something dangerous. It was risky, of course, but it was also part of their world. They set sail from Atafu, one of the more populated islands, with an outboard motor, a few bottles of water, some bread, and an innocent conviction that they would be back in a few hours. They didn't inform their families. They didn't think it was necessary. It was one of those impulses that seem logical at 14. Go out, explore, feel the breeze on their faces, and prove they could do it on their own. What they didn't know was that this small trip would turn into one of the longest drifts ever recorded in the Pacific. Shortly after leaving, the engine began to fail. A lost spark, a dirty mix of gasoline, a poorly adjusted vibration. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, but it was enough to leave them adrift. They tried to return using the oars, but the current had already decided to carry them farther out to sea, silently, without drama, without anyone on the island noticing. By the time someone noticed their absence, it was too late. They had disappeared without leaving a single clue. The search began the next day. Helicopters, boats, radio messages. Possible routes were plotted. Winds and tides were consulted. For a week, the area was combed. No signs. Not a bottle, not a board, not a shout. After a few days, the authorities suspended the official search. And then, the mourning began. The families cried, the community wore black, and the names of the 3 boys began to float in the air like broken prayers. But they were still there, floating in a boat with no shade, no map, and no time. In the first days, hunger and thirst became an immediate presence. The sun burned their skin relentlessly. The aluminium of the boat heated up to unbearable levels. The water ran out in 2 days, and the few food supplies didn't last to satisfy even a small part of the growing bodies that demanded sustenance. They had to learn quickly to survive. They gathered the dew that fell in the early morning, collected rainwater when they could, and when the sky refused to give them a drop, they sucked on wet rags with saliva, hoping to trick their bodies. Hunger was something else, crueler, more persistent. One of them managed to catch a flying fish that jumped into the boat, and it became a silent feast. They ate it raw, without thinking. Then, they tied plastic bags to the end of a stick to try to catch something else. Each catch was a miracle. The rest of the time, they chewed empty shells, bit pieces of wood, and imagined dishes that would never arrive. They began to talk about foods they liked, describing them in detail as if by mentioning them, they could taste them again. Imagination was their best resource, but also a trap. The more they dreamed, the more it hurt to have nothing. Their skin began to peel, their hands cracked, their feet burned from constant contact with the metal and salt water. They spent days without speaking to each other, immersed in a kind of trance where the body becomes a machine, and the mind seeks refuge in any corner that doesn't hurt. Sometimes they wondered if anyone was looking for them. Other times they didn't think at all. They just breathed. They covered their faces with wet shirts. They took turns watching the horizon. But the horizon was always the same. Flat, blue, infinite. And then came the moment when they stopped counting the days. They didn't know if it was Tuesday or Friday, if they had been gone for 2 weeks or 3. The sun marked the passage of hours, but it didn't tell them how many had passed. They lost track of time. One of them claimed to have seen an island. They knelt to row with their hands, with their feet, with whatever they had, but it was a mirage. Another day, a plane passed far away. They jumped, waved a t-shirt, shouted until their voices tore. The plane continued its course. The silence of the sea became heavier than ever. And then, when they expected nothing, when they were asleep under an improvised tarp to protect themselves from the sun, a fishing boat found them. They were 1,300 kilometers from where they had disappeared. Floating like a bottled message, dehydrated, with sunken faces, gray skin, but alive. The captain of the boat, an experienced New Zealander, couldn't understand how they had gotten so far. Neither could they. They were taken to land. They were given fluids, fed slowly, like someone who hasn't chewed in too long. At first, they couldn't speak properly. They stuttered, cried, laughed without logic. They didn't understand if it was real. When the doctors confirmed they had no irreversible damage, it was as if the world began to rebuild around them. The families received them as if the sea had returned them by whim, as if it were a second chance written from some corner that has no explanation. No one expected it. No one fully understood it. But there they were. The case of the 3 teenagers from Tokelau became international news. Many tried to explain how they survived so long in such a precarious boat. Others focused on their willpower, their faith, their connection to each other. But the truth lies somewhere in between, in that zone where science doesn't reach, and where the human merges with the wild. They were not heroes. They were not enlightened. They were 3 boys who resisted without knowing how, without knowing for how long, and without giving themselves permission to give up. Today, each one follows their own path. They speak little about that time. They say they remember it as if it were a dream, a space without clocks, without calendars, where everything boiled down to surviving one more night. And perhaps, in that timeless boat, what happened was not just a struggle against the sea, but a way of growing suddenly, of understanding that life, sometimes, is held by nothing more than an invisible thread, and that as long as that thread is not cut, everything is possible. The 12 hours in the eye of the hurricane, Joshua Morgan. The sea has a particular way of keeping its secrets. It does not shout, does not explain, does not excuse itself. When it decides to envelop someone, it does so without ceremony, as if it were part of an ancient plan for which no one has the map. This is how fisherman Joshua Morgan, a solitary man with a weathered face and a gaze like a dead lighthouse, disappeared in the middle of the ocean during one of the worst storms recorded in the Caribbean in the last decade, and returned telling a story that seemed to have occurred outside of time, in a place as improbable as it was terrifying. The exact heart of a hurricane. It all began with an apparently simple decision. Joshua had gone out fishing, as he did 2 or 3 times a week, from a small port on the southern coast of Belize. His boat, an old wooden hull reinforced with rusted rivets and an outboard motor, knew him better than anything else in his life. It wasn't a fast or modern boat, but it had never failed him. The weather forecast spoke of sporadic rain, nothing out of the ordinary. To Joshua, that was irrelevant. He read the sea as one reads the gestures of a familiar face. If the wind didn't whistle strangely, if the birds didn't fly off in a group, then it was safe. Or so he thought. What he didn't know was that to the north of his route, a tropical storm that still had no name at dawn was already forming with disordered violence. While he cast nets with a serenity that only old fishermen can maintain, weather satellites showed increasingly compact spirals at the center of the Caribbean, and the pressure began to fall at an alarming rate. By noon, the wind started to change. It wasn't a gust. It was a sort of humid yawn that began to pick up strength, raising the sea's surface and making it breathe as though something were waking beneath it. Joshua started the motor with the intention of returning, but the waves were no longer small. They were walls. In less than an hour, visibility disappeared. The sky became a uniform mass of dark gray, and the rain began to fall in impossible diagonals. The engine failed. The rudder resisted. And the sea, which until recently had been a companion of routine, became a faceless animal. What followed was a chaos of absurd proportions. The boat jumped between crests of water 6 or 7 meters high. Joshua tried to tie himself to the central mast with ropes, but the wind whipped him like a whip of salt and foam. He lost control of his boat several times. The bow rose, fell, and hit the sea with a dry noise. Time ceased to exist. Only surviving between each wave remained. And suddenly, without warning, everything stopped. It was like entering another world. The sky, which had been a mass of ash, opened into a nearly perfect circle. The wind stopped abruptly. The sea, though still choppy, became less aggressive. The sun filtered through from above like a forgotten coin. Joshua Morgan had been trapped in the exact center of the hurricane. The eye. For the next 12 hours, his boat remained floating in that absurd calm, surrounded by a wall of clouds spinning violently around him, as if he were inside a stadium formed by air and water in motion. The silence was so deep he could hear his own breathing echoing against the cabin walls. The air had a strange smell, a mixture of ozone and wet wood. He didn't know how long it would last, but he knew it was a gift, a pause that he had to make the most of. In this suspended calm, Joshua worked on repairs as best he could. He cut pieces of canvas to cover the gaps in the hull, secured the engine with an improvised anchor, collected rainwater falling from the edge of the clouds, and prepared for what was to come. Because he knew the eye was only the breather. The other half would follow, and often it is worse than the first. He ate a couple of canned sardines he still had, drank cautiously, and stayed awake the entire time. Not out of fear, but because he felt that sleeping in that place would be like closing his eyes at the edge of an abyss. He thought of his daughter, who lived in the capital, of the dog he had left at home, whether anyone knew he was missing yet. He looked at the walls of clouds as if they were sleeping beasts, and he waited. When the second part of the hurricane finally arrived, it was as if the sea had swallowed its own calm and spat fury in every direction. The wind returned with double the strength. The boat was lifted like a dry leaf. Joshua clung to the edge of the hull with bloodied nails. For hours he was battered by water, wind, and fear. He didn't know if his body could withstand another night like that. He didn't know if the wood would hold. The eye had been a miracle, but now everything was once again a relentless struggle. They found him 2 days later, over 170 kilometers from where he had disappeared, floating in the middle of the sea, with the boat almost broken and his body covered in bruises. He had been spotted by a rescue helicopter combing the area after the hurricane had passed. He was alive, though with hypothermia, dehydration, and on the brink of collapse. They lifted him onto a stretcher, covered him with thermal blankets, and took him straight to the hospital. He didn't speak for 2 days. He barely slept. He just stared at the ceiling, with the same expression one wears when one has been too long in the face of death. When he finally regained his strength and could tell what had happened, he did so with few words, without drama. He described the eye of the hurricane as a place where everything seemed frozen, as if someone had turned off the world and left it on pause for a while. He said that at that moment he felt no fear, only a kind of calm resignation. He knew it was rare to be alive, and he accepted it. His story spread through the local media, and soon it went around the Caribbean. Some didn't believe him. Others admired him. He didn't care about any of it. He returned to fishing a few months later, with another boat, with another engine, but with the same eyes. Eyes that, since that day, no longer sought just fish in the water, but signs in the sky. Joshua Morgan didn't write a book. He didn't seek fame. He didn't make documentaries. But his passage through the eye of the storm remained engraved as a reminder that the sea can, sometimes, open a parenthesis in the middle of its fury. A moment of pause, an improbable silence. And that sometimes, just sometimes, surviving doesn't mean fighting against the storm, but accepting its rhythm, waiting and resisting until it passes. The surfer lost overnight. Ian McAllister. The sea can seem like a familiar place when standing on a board, reading the shape of the waves, feeling how the current pushes with the gentle rhythm of a deep breath. For those who have surfed for years, like Ian McAllister, the ocean is neither an enemy nor a mystery. It is a companion. But there are moments when that trust, no matter how solid it seems, can break in seconds. And what was once a game of balance turns into a fight for survival, with no room for error, no lights to guide the way back. Ian, a native Californian, had spent much of his life by the beach. He was one of those types who wakes up before dawn, who smells the salt air as if he could predict the waves, who understands the wind's shifts faster than any app. Surfing wasn't just a sport for him. It was a way of life, a form of physical meditation in constant motion. That September afternoon, on the north shore of Oahu, Hawaii, the conditions were almost perfect. Gentle side wind, open sea with good swell, clear sky. Ian didn't hesitate to hit the water, with his 6-foot board and his mind focused on one thing only: to surf until his body could take no more. He entered the water at 5:30 when the sun was already beginning to set. He knew the window was tight, but the temptation of those perfect waves was too strong. He paddled farther than usual, following a set that broke with a steady rhythm. He enjoyed it. He glided, cut through foam, let gravity and the board do their work, one after the other. When he realized, the coast was no longer so close, and the sky had turned a darker blue, as if someone had turned off the switch too fast. At some point between the last wave and the attempt to return, a rip current began dragging him out to sea. It wasn't a violent pull. It was subtle, constant, as if the water was pushing him to a zone where the rules of the day no longer applied. Ian tried paddling with all his strength, but he wasn't making progress. His board was no longer an ally, but a directionless platform. When he looked towards the coast and saw only shadows, he understood that he was lost. The night fell completely. There was no moon. The stars were few. The sea was a black sheet that reflected nothing. He was completely alone, adrift, without a life jacket, without light, without company, floating on his board in an ocean that seemed endless. The sound of the waves changed. They were no longer predictable crashes over a sandy bottom. They were scattered murmurs, invisible crashes, deep breaths of the water in its rawest state. The first impulse was the logical one. Don't panic. Breathe. Keep a cool head. Count the seconds. Create a routine. But the hours passed and the cold began to creep between skin and bone. Ian lay on his stomach on the board, hugging it like a piece of home. He couldn't swim without direction, so he floated. He recalled his apnea training, the need to conserve energy, to reduce movements to a minimum. He tried not to think about sharks, although he knew they were there, invisible, present. At some point in the early morning, he began to see very faint lights on the horizon. They weren't ships, nor cities. They were faint flashes that went up and down like heartbeats, as if someone had randomly turned on a lantern. He wondered if they were real, or part of exhaustion. Maybe bioluminescence from plankton. Maybe nothing. But he clung to those lights as if they were an invisible beacon. He decided to paddle towards them. The hours stretched like rubber. His body began to ache in a different way. It wasn't the pain from physical effort. It was the pain of being at the limit, of having emptied every corner of reserve. He stayed awake, speaking softly, repeating his name, his sister's birthdays, the color of the swimsuit he wore, anything to keep from disappearing inside his head. Sometimes the silence was so thick, he wondered if the world was still there. Around 3 a.m., when the current had pushed him over 8 kilometers out to sea, something happened that marked a turning point. A change in the water temperature, just a few degrees, but enough for his body to notice. It was a sign of a different current. Something told him to change direction. He paddled south, with the board as a guide and intuition as his only compass. The sea began to show different swells, longer, more spaced out. Then, as if it were a reward for his patience, he felt a breeze that smelled like land. And there it appeared. Still far, but visible. A fixed light, yellow, solitary. A lighthouse. Maybe a buoy. Maybe a house. It didn't matter. It was a static point in a liquid universe. And that was enough. He paddled towards that light as if each stroke were a confession. His body ached, his hands were broken, his lips cracked, but his will was stronger. He knew he had to reach it. At dawn, when the sun began to lift an orange veil over the horizon, Ian touched land. It wasn't a tourist beach or a comfortable bay. It was a rocky cliff, filled with algae, sharp stones, and cracks wet from the tide. He crawled on all fours, dragging his board like someone carrying a cross. There was no one, but he was alive. He was found by a group of local fishermen hours later. He had mild hypothermia, but no serious injuries. They wrapped him in blankets, gave him sugar water, and took him to the nearest port. His family had already started looking for him. It had been just over 12 hours since he went missing. Only 12. But for Ian, they had been eternal. What was most curious was what he said afterward, that he didn't feel fear, that he didn't cry, that in the darkness of the ocean, in the middle of that endless night, there were moments of peace, as if the sea, in its vastness, had accepted him for a while, as if between him and the waves there was a silent agreement of respect. He had been on the edge, but hadn't fallen. Ian McAllister went back to surfing weeks later. Many questioned him, but for him, there was no other way to close that chapter. Returning to the water was returning to the beginning, to the board, to the wave, to that place where it all started before the night claimed him. His story is not one of an epic shipwreck. It is the story of a dark night on a surfboard, a night that could have been the end, but turned out to be a test of endurance, of calm under pressure, of blind trust in what cannot be seen. Because sometimes all you need to return is a board, a distant light, and the decision not to give up, even when you don't know where you are. The raft of the Peruvian fisherman. On the shores of the Pacific, facing the immense horizon that separates Peru from the blue abyss, there is a silence that sneaks between the boats as if the sea kept ancient secrets, stories it does not always wish to share. One of those stories happened in 2001 when 3 fishermen set out to fish in a humble boat, planning to return by sunset like any other day. But the sea that day had other plans. It pushed them far away without warning and forced them to face something greater than hunger or fear, the real possibility of not returning. Carlos, Efrain, and Luis were men of the sea, not university educated or literate, but they knew how to read the sky as one reads a poem. They left from a small port near Chiclayo with a reinforced wooden raft, an outboard motor, simple nets, and a backpack with water, bread, matches, and tobacco. Like every time they went out, they promised to return before dark. Their families saw them off with the calm of people who have repeated the scene 1,000 times. There was no threat in the air. Not even the seagulls behaved any differently. But at noon, the engine stopped. It was a small failure at first, a strange sound, a vibration that didn't quite fit. They tried to repair it while floating among the gentle waves, confident that they would fix it soon. But the sea is a master at exploiting moments of weakness. A slow but constant cross-current began pushing them westward. In an hour, the coast had become a distant shadow. In 3 hours, it was gone. And with it, the references, the cardinal points, the safety of the known. The radio didn't work. There was no signal. The engine didn't respond. And the raft, although sturdy, wasn't designed to cross oceans. It was, at best, a floating table with the soul of a box. As night fell, it was impossible to hide the reality any longer. They were adrift. No one was looking for them yet, and they didn't know where the current was taking them. During the first days, they clung to routine. Each had assigned tasks. One watched the sky, another tried to fish with improvised hooks, the third kept dark thoughts at bay. The food didn't last long. The bread turned to stone, the water began to run low, and the tobacco, which seemed like a useless luxury, became the only relief from anxiety. Staying calm was a decision that had to be made every hour. Soon they began living off what the sea offered. They tied pieces of wire to fragments of the nets to catch small fish. Some days were generous, a flying fish, a sardine, even a mackerel. Other times there was nothing. They chewed fish skin, dried it in the sun, rationed it as if it were gold. In one of their most desperate moments, they caught a turtle. The meat was tough, strong, but filling. The blood, though hard to drink, gave them some strength. By that point, disgust had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Water was another challenge. The salt dried their lips, cracked their tongues, and made their breath hot and murky. When it rained, they opened their mouths like children, stretched out shirts, and filled empty bottles with every drop they could catch. On some cloudy days, not a single drop fell, and they were forced to urinate in containers, drinking that sour mix again with their eyes closed, as if drinking poison and hoping it wouldn't kill them. The nights grew longer. The total darkness of the ocean is something that cannot be explained with words. It is a blackness that weighs, that enters the thoughts, that turns every movement into a threat. Sharks began to appear. At first they were distant shadows, then bodies that circled the raft slowly, almost curiously. Once one struck the side with its fin, as if testing the resistance of the hull. Sleeping was impossible. They took turns keeping watch, with a stick in hand, as if that would help. More than 20 days passed without seeing land, without seeing ships, without hearing human voices. During that time, Luis began to deteriorate. He didn't speak, barely ate. His body grew cold despite the sun's heat. One night, he stopped moving. Carlos and Efrain held him until morning, not knowing what to do. They couldn't bury him, they couldn't keep him, and so they let him go. They watched him float away on his back, arms extended as if he were already resting. After that, everything changed. Time became slower, thicker. The days started to look alike. Efrain spoke less, and Carlos began to hallucinate. Sometimes he saw his house from the raft. Other times, he thought he heard bells, children's laughter, footsteps on dry wood. There was no land, no salvation, but they were still alive, although they didn't know for how much longer. Finally, on the 34th day, a Colombian fishing boat spotted something in the distance. A floating, irregular structure that looked more like a piece of wreckage than a real boat. They approached. They saw two men, one standing, the other hunched over, both covered in salt, with cracked skin, sunken eyes, and lips burst open by the sun. They didn't speak. They didn't signal. They were just there, like statues surviving from an abandoned sea temple. They were brought aboard. They were wrapped in blankets, given serum, soup, and fresh water. They couldn't eat immediately, but over time, they regained some strength. When they reached port, they were already news. The media called them the shipwrecked of the North. The families cried upon seeing them return. They embraced them as one would embrace something already buried. The doctors said it was a miracle. They said it was resilience. That when one wants to return, one finds a way. Carlos and Efrain didn't return to the sea for a long time. They said they had left something out there, something they could no longer recover. But they didn't give up their story. They told it without embellishments, without heroic phrases. They spoke of hunger, of thirst, of the body becoming animal, of the nights when everything trembles inside, and of the day when, finally, the sea brought them back. Because sometimes the sea doesn't want to kill you. It just wants you to understand how much it costs to live. The downed pilot, Luis Zamperini. There are lives that seem designed to challenge every limit, to break everything that seems impossible and then keep moving forward as if nothing happened. Luis Zamperini's life is one of those, and his journey through the sea wasn't just a chapter. It was the stage where survival stopped being a theory and became a daily battle, with no respite. Zamperini was not just a war pilot. He was also not just an Olympic athlete. He was a man with extraordinary endurance, someone whom fate threw into the ocean to test him, floating for 47 days on a raft in the middle of the Pacific, between hunger, sharks, the sun that scorches the skin, and the fear of becoming just another name lost in the records of war. Luis had grown up in California, the son of Italian immigrants with a tough childhood, marked by street fights and a rebelliousness that seemed unstoppable. But he found an escape route in athletics, and through running, he made a name for himself. He competed in the 1936 Berlin Olympics when he was only 19, earning the respect of all for his speed, his commitment, and the way he pushed his body as if it would never break. When World War II broke out, he traded his track shoes for pilot boots and joined the United States Air Force. He was a bombardier on the B-24, a hunk of metal flying over the Pacific on missions as risky as they were confusing. On one of those sorties, in May of 1943, the plane he was on crashed into the ocean due to a mechanical failure while searching for another lost crew. In the impact, most of the crew died. Only 3 men survived: Lewis, his friend Phil, and the gunner Mac. They were on an inflatable raft with 2 paddles, a couple of cans of water, some chocolate, and the absolute uncertainty of not knowing how long they would be adrift. From day one, the sea was a silent enemy. The heat was suffocating, the nights freezing, and the salty water opened wounds on their skin as if they had sandpaper on their bodies. There was no land in sight, no boats, no radio, only the sound of the water and their own voices, which, over time, also began to fall silent. They began with a forced routine. They spoke little, took turns watching the horizon, and treated their supplies as if they were made of glass. But Mac, overwhelmed by fear, gave in to hunger on the first night and ate the entire chocolate bar. An impulsive act that cost them dearly. For days they ate nothing. The sun beat down on them relentlessly. Blisters appeared on their hands, lips, and feet. Their tongues dried up. When it rained, they opened their mouths like shipwrecked sailors from ancient times, thanking every drop as if it were wine. In the first few weeks, they survived by catching small fish with their hands, even seabirds that landed on the raft. Lewis would slaughter them with precision, pluck the feathers, and they ate what they could raw, between disgust and gratitude. But hunger was not the worst part. The worst part was the sharks. Every day without fail, they circled the raft. Some swam below for hours, others rammed the side as if testing the material's resistance. Louis learned to hit them with a paddle, scare them off with shouts, even use them as food when they managed to kill one. It was a constant balance between being the prey or the hunter. And there, in the midst of this chess game with death, the mind started playing its own cards. A few days later, Mac could not resist any longer. He weakened, stopped talking, and died on the raft, staring at the sky as if he had found something in it. Louis and Phil buried him in the sea. It was the first funeral act of many they thought they would perform. The raft became a floating temple, a prison, a trench without weapons. Life was reduced to floating, waiting, hunting, enduring. Their legs shrank, their bones were marked. Louis, who had been pure fiber on the track in Berlin, was now a dry body, with sunken eyes and willpower as his only intact muscle. Once a Japanese plane flew over them. They thought they might be rescued, but instead of help, they received bullets. The shrapnel pierced part of the raft. Louis and Phil jumped into the water, floating among sharks to avoid being hit. It was a double hell, dodging death from the sky and avoiding it under the water. Still, they survived. They patched up the holes as best they could, using cords, makeshift patches, and kept floating. Finally, after 47 days, they spotted land. It was a small atoll in the Marshall Islands. They cried. They hugged. They had to crawl with what little strength they had left to the shore. But what seemed like the end of the torment was barely the beginning of another. There they were captured by Japanese soldiers and sent to a prison camp. There, Louis would suffer beatings, torture, humiliations, and months of pain at the hands of his captors. But that is another story. The truth is that Zamperini survived the ocean. He returned. He told his story, and for years he didn't talk much about what he had lived through. He said the time on the raft had been the hardest part, even harder than the camp, because there was no visible enemy, only silence, only hunger, only time passing with cruelty. Years later, his story was told by Laura Hillenbrand in the book Unbroken, and adapted into a film that tried to capture part of that brutal odyssey. But no book or movie can tell it all. What was essential in what Zamperini lived through was engraved in his body, in his memory, in that intimate corner where fear and hope fight without rest. Luis lived many years. He spoke before thousands. He forgave his captors. He went back to Japan. He dedicated his life to telling what it means to endure, even when it seems like there is no reason to do so. And perhaps that is the most valuable thing he left with his passage through the ocean. The living proof that, when everything is lost, there is still something to hold on to. Something stronger than the body. Something that floats. The ship of the sleeping children. The Gloria Maris case. The Gloria Maris was not an imposing ship, nor did it have a legendary history. It was a simple vessel, with a steel hull painted white and a name written in golden letters that peeled with time. It operated from the coast of the Philippines, and like many other school ships in islands where transportation is water and not asphalt, it served the purpose of taking children and teenagers from small, scattered villages to an educational center on the island of Luzon. 46 students boarded it that morning, with their backpacks on their backs, shoes damp from the mist, and that light sleep that comes from waking up before the sun. Also on board were 2 teachers, a cook, and 3 crew members who knew the routes of the channel well. The trip was not supposed to take more than 4 hours. They left just before dawn, when the sky was still a mix of black and violet, and the engine roared with the strength of the beginning of any day. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. The first sign was the silence on the radio. Then, the delay. Hours passed. The Gloria Maris did not reach the port, and the school raised the alarm. The authorities thought it was a minor breakdown, perhaps a stop due to bad weather. But as night fell with no news, the unease began to spread like a chill down the spine of an entire town. The official search began the next day. 3 helicopters, 5 boats, and volunteers from neighboring villages went to sea. The Coast Guard did not have a confirmed last location. There were no signals, no calls, no registered emergencies. Only a usual route, and a missing vessel in the midst of calm waters. The confusion was absolute. 48 hours passed before they found it. The Gloria Maris appeared adrift, leaning to port, with one of the sails torn to shreds and the paint worn out as if it had been under the sun for weeks. What was curious was not just that it floated with no visible crew. What was chilling, what froze the voice of the first rescuer upon boarding, was what they found inside. The children were there, sleeping. All of them. They were not injured. They were not tied up. They had not been abandoned. They were lying between the corridors, in the cabins, some curled up with backpacks as pillows, others wrapped in blankets. They were breathing normally. Their pulses were strong, and their body temperature was only slightly lower than usual. One by one, they woke up, as if returning from a deep sleep. But the unsettling part was something else. None of them remembered what had happened. Some thought it had been a normal trip and that they were about to arrive. Others didn't know if they had slept one night or a week. They didn't talk about fear, cold, or hunger, only about a kind of tiredness. What they described most clearly was a detail that left doctors and psychologists baffled. They all claimed to have dreamed the same thing. A dark place, very quiet, with water up to their knees. And someone, a faceless figure, wrapped in a kind of long, wet cloak, making them sit in a circle without speaking. The adults did not appear. Neither the captain, nor the sailors, nor the teachers. The kitchen was intact, with half-prepared food remnants. The bridge had the instruments turned off. but there were no signs of struggle or damage. The lifeboats were in place. And the most puzzling thing of all, the amount of stored drinking water indicated that it hadn't been used in the last 2 days. No child showed signs of dehydration. The investigation became international. Military doctors, neuroscience experts, child psychologists. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened. Collective hypnosis? A gas leak? An unknown drug? There were no chemical traces or physical marks. And yet, something had happened on that ship. Something that left it floating in silence with 46 children asleep, and no adults on board. Over time, the media dubbed the case the Ship of the Sleeping Children, and the name stuck. Some believed it was a case of covered-up piracy. Others pointed to a collective traumatic experience that the mind blocked out. There were also those who clung to the paranormal. They spoke of sea curses, ghost ships, mythological figures from Filipino folklore who kidnap adults and spare the innocent. But no version could prove anything conclusively. The truth is that the children, now adults, have grown up with that story as a shadow that not everyone wants to revisit. Some never got on a boat again. Others say that sometimes they dream of that faceless figure, with the sound of water beneath their feet and the silence that surrounded them like a fog blanket. The Gloria Maris was towed to land. It spent years abandoned in a military shipyard. No one wanted to use it again. It rusted until it became unrecognizable, and a storm eventually split it in two. Its remains sank off the coast, where there are still those who claim to have seen it reappear on moonless nights, with lights off and the curtains moving without wind. What happened on that ship remains without a clear explanation. Perhaps it never will. The only certainty is that, for at least 2 days, 46 children slept a deep sleep in the middle of the ocean, without fear, without hunger, without time. And upon waking, nothing was the same again. The woman who spoke with whales, Sophie Lemaire. No one called her crazy, nor visionary. Sophie Lemaire was one of those people who don't need to explain who they are because what they do says it all. Born on the coast of Brittany, France, she lived among nautical maps, notebooks dampened by salt, and marine recordings that she had been collecting with an old submerged microphone since she was 20 years old. Her life wasn't a city story, nor one of prestigious universities or laboratories. It was a story of open seas, of nights listening to cetacean songs as if they were poetry, of early mornings with wet feet and eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for invisible signals. In 2008, Sophie boarded a small sailboat with a reinforced fiberglass hull, which she herself modified to also function as a floating laboratory. The boat was called Licum and was only 12 meters long. Her plan was to sail through the South Pacific, between the deep waters near Tonga and New Zealand, where hundreds of humpback whales migrated every year. She wanted to record their songs, analyze them, sleep with them. Not to publish them in scientific journals or present them at conferences, but to understand something that, according to her, wasn't in the sounds, but in the pauses. She departed from Tahiti with provisions for 6 weeks and a study agenda as simple as it was intimate. Listen. And during the first days, that was all. She launched the hydrophones, waited in silence, recorded the vibrations. Sometimes hours would pass without a single sound. Other times, the songs were so clear she felt surrounded by an underwater choir. She slept little, wrote a lot, and spoke to herself. Not out of loneliness, but because she had learned that, in the middle of the sea, the voice is also a way to not disappear. On the night of the 27th day of her journey, a storm changed everything. It wasn't devastating at first, just irregular winds, a light drizzle. Sophie prepared as she always did, tied the sailboat, lowered the sails, adjusted the antenna. But the sea grew quickly, without warning. Within hours, the waves were over 5 meters high. The wind howled, and the main mast, damaged by an old crack she hadn't seen, broke as if it were made of wet paper. Lecum was adrift. Sophie tried to use the auxiliary motor, but water had entered the electrical systems. The GPS died with a spark. The batteries drained. She found herself alone, hundreds of kilometers from land, with no communication, on a damaged sailboat spinning on itself with every shake. During the night, she could do nothing but endure. She tied her body to the navigation bench and waited. At dawn, the sea calmed, but the boat was already a floating trap. She couldn't move forward, communicate, or maintain her course. Sophie knew that no one was looking for her yet. Her plan was solitary and flexible. She could go another week without contact and no alarms would be triggered. And then she understood that she had to accept a simple truth. She would have to wait. And it was in that suspended time where the strange occurred. On the third day adrift, when the mental drift began to seep into her thoughts, Sophie heard a song. Low, deep, long, very close to the boat. She went up on deck, barefoot, wrapped in an old poncho, her eyes squinting from the sun. She looked at the sea. At first, nothing. And then, a silhouette. A humpback whale, immense, less than 10 meters away. It stayed close, not moving much, as if it were floating just to let her see it. That day, the whale didn't leave. It circled the boat for hours. Sophie lowered the hydrophone, recorded every sound, but also stayed silent, sitting, watching. The next morning, another one appeared. Then a third. It wasn't a pod. They were solitary. They approached, floated nearby, sang, and stayed. Lecum was surrounded. For 4 days, the whales were there, like a marine guard not allowing loneliness to turn into despair. Sophie, who had always believed that there was a language in the songs, began to respond. She struck the boat's hull with her open palm. 3 times, then 4. She waited. Sometimes she received a response, a long, high-pitched sound, rising and falling like a stretched rope. She wrote down every exchange. She didn't call it communication. She called it companionship. On the 5th day, she saw a large shadow move in the distance. It wasn't a whale. It was a boat, a green-hull fishing vessel, the kind that crosses trade routes without looking much around. Sophie went up on deck with a mirror, waved it, shouted. Nothing. Then something happened that cannot be explained, but which she always narrated with a simple conviction, without embellishments. One of the whales struck the water with its fin 3 times, hard, like a signal. The boat turned, slowly, and headed toward her. The rescue was quick. She was dehydrated, feverish, but lucid. She told what had happened without altering her voice. She didn't speak of miracles, nor of mystical signs. She just said what she saw. The whales were there. Not before, not after, just when she needed them the most. Back on land, some treated her like a lucky woman. Others said she was delirious. That heat and hunger confuse. But the recordings were there. Whole days of songs near the sailboat, and the repeated patterns. The responses to her knocks. The noises around the hull. The sea doesn't lie when it's recorded. And Lecum was a witness to something. Sophie didn't return to the sea immediately, but she didn't leave it either. She dedicated herself to transcribing, organizing, sharing. She never wrote a book. She didn't give long interviews. She only said once, "The whales didn't save me. I'm not that special. They were just there," as if they knew what it's like to float without direction. And that was enough. The young man who disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, Derek Hansen. Sometimes a common name and a brief story are enough to fuel a myth. Derek Hansen wasn't famous, nor rich, nor did he seek to break any records. He was a 19-year-old boy, thin, quiet, with an easy laugh and a calm obsession with the sea. Born in Sarasota, Florida, He spent more time among docks, nautical maps, and engine tools than at parties or on social media. He had grown up hearing stories of the Bermuda Triangle, that ghostly triangle between Miami, Puerto Rico, and the Bermuda Islands, where, according to many, ships and planes disappear without a trace. But he didn't believe in legends. What interested him was sailing. He built his first boat at 15, using recycled pieces from an abandoned shipyard and the plans he got from an old fishing magazine. He tested it in the canal behind his grandmother's house. It capsized twice, and he laughed both times. 4 years later, he had a sturdier one, an 8-meter sailboat he named Lucidity. It wasn't fast, nor particularly beautiful, but it was made by him, and that was enough. With that boat, he planned a solo trip through the Caribbean. Nothing extreme, a 1-week journey, round trip from Fort Lauderdale, sailing down the East Coast and around the Bahamas. He set sail on June 12, 2014, with favorable weather and provisions for 10 days. Water, rye bread, cans of tuna, a flashlight, a shortwave radio, and a manual compass as backup. He also carried his logbook, where he wrote everything: coordinates, speed, wind changes, thoughts. A meticulous record that said more about him than any social media. For the first 3 days, everything went as planned. The wind blew from the east, the sun burned, and the Lucidity moved steadily. In the last notes he wrote, Derek talked about the clarity of the water, about some dolphins that followed him for almost half an hour, and about how much he thought about returning home and telling his younger sister everything, who always told him the sea was crazy. But after the 3rd day, the logbook stops. No more ink, no more pages. Radio contact was lost on June 15th at 5:47 p.m. "All good, steady wind," was the last thing he said. And then, silence. The Coast Guard began searching the next day, after receiving the alert from his father. He had been raised with responsibility. He was supposed to check in every day at the same time. When he didn't, alarms went off. The search was immediate. Planes, helicopters, speedboats. They checked the route, nearby areas, sandbanks, reefs. No sail, no oar, no sign of a shipwreck. As if the Lucidity and Derek had been swallowed by the ocean without leaving a shadow. 5 days passed. Then a week. The search was expanded, then reduced. And eventually, it was called off. But 2 weeks later, a Panamanian freighter reported something. Off the Turks Islands, nearly 600 kilometers from the point where Derek disappeared, they had spotted a white vessel adrift. It was the Lucidity. When they boarded, no one was there. The sail was torn, the instruments turned off. The radio had been ripped from its mount. The compass still hung from the neck of an empty bottle. But the logbook was there, closed, dry, protected in a sealed bag inside a compartment beneath the helm seat. The last entries were still the same. Nothing strange. No mention of a storm, no technical failures. Not a single word suggesting anything went wrong. The official hypothesis was an accidental fall. Maybe Derek slipped, fell into the water, and the boat continued without him. But those who knew him knew it wasn't that simple. He slept with a harness, used safety ropes even in calm conditions. He had training. He had taken courses. And besides, how could you explain the rest? Why was there no sign of disorder, of a crash, on the sailboat? Why was the radio torn out? Over time, the story began to take on other nuances. People on forums started talking about strange interferences in the recordings of that area in the days prior. A radio operator said he had picked up a weak Morse signal that matched the Lucidity's registration, but it was broken, as if it came from very far away, or from below. Another sailor claimed to have seen a spherical light dive into the water just before his compass began to fail. But there was no proof. just echoes. And deep down, the only concrete thing was this. Derek Hansen, a 19-year-old boy, disappeared in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle without leaving clear signs. His boat was found floating aimlessly. And no one, until today, has been able to explain what happened during those hours when he was no longer there. His parents kept his room intact for years. The sailboat was towed, repaired, and finally returned to the family. His younger sister learned to sail soon after. She said she wanted to understand what her brother had seen, or what he had faced. She never believed he simply fell. She didn't believe in ghosts either. But she did believe there are things in the sea that we still don't understand. And maybe we don't need to understand them. Derek unintentionally became part of the myth. His story was absorbed by the Bermuda Triangle's lore as if it were just another piece of the puzzle that never quite fits. Some see it as another accident, others as proof that something strange inhabits those waters. But there is one thing everyone agrees on. He didn't leave because he wanted to, nor because he failed. Something out there took him. And amid all the stories told between storms, sharks, hunger, and fire, his may be the most unsettling. One where the sea neither punishes nor saves. It just disappears. If any of these stories left you thinking, sent chills down your spine, or reminded you that the sea always holds something more, comment on which one impacted you the most. I want to read them. This channel grows thanks to you, those who listen until the end, who feel what I tell and make it yours. I'll see you on the next journey. And in the meantime, don't turn your back on the sea.